The digital chime from the radio on my hip was an unwelcome intrusion, a sterile sound in the ancient living world of the Redwood Vista Reserve. I was halfway through my patrol route, enjoying the rare patch of sunlight that had managed to pierce the colossal canopy. The voice that crackled through was thin, panicked a hiker, probably some tourist from the city who'd never seen a forest bigger than a city park. "Ranger Wallace, this is dispatch. We have a call from a Mr. Peterson on the Sentinel Trail loop. He's reporting, give me a second, a strange smell and piles of fur." I keyed the mic. "Dispatch, this is Wallace. Tell Mr. Peterson to continue on his route and not to disturb the area. I'm about 20 minutes out. Is he still on the line?" "Negative, Ranger." He sounded pretty spooked. Said he was getting out of there. Mentioned something about it being wrong. "Copy that," I sighed, already turning my truck around. Wrong could mean anything. Usually, it meant a poached deer or a bear that had gotten into a camper's illegal food stash, annoying, but part of the job. Still, the Sentinel Trail was deep in the park, far from the usual tourist spots. It wasn't an area known for much activity, animal or human. The service road was more of a suggestion than a path, a narrow ribbon of packed earth weaving between the redwood colossi. These trees were the original landlords, silent and patient, their bark like wrinkled, fibrous armor. Driving among them always felt like trespassing in a cathedral built for giants. As the truck rumbled deeper, I noticed it, the quiet. It wasn't peaceful silence. It was a heavy, listening silence. The constant chatter of jays, the rustle of squirrels in the undergrowth, the distant call of a hawk, all gone. The forest was holding its breath. I've been a ranger for 15 years, and that kind of silence is never a good sign. It's the kind of quiet that precedes a predator's strike. I parked where the service road dead-ended and killed the engine. The silence pressed in, broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine block. I grabbed my pack, checked the load on my tranquilizer rifle, standard procedure for a potential bear encounter, and headed toward the trail marker. The air was thick with the usual scent of damp earth and redwood duff, but underneath it was something else. A coppery, musky odor that clung to the back of my throat. The smell of a slaughterhouse. I found the site about a quarter-mile in. It wasn't just a single carcass. It was a clearing, roughly 100 feet in diameter, that had been turned into an abattoir. The ground was littered with the mangled remains of at least half a dozen deer and a few coyotes. It was sheer carnage. Visceral and absolute rib cages were splayed open like grotesque flowers, limbs torn from sockets, heads twisted at unnatural angles. Flies buzzed in a thick, shimmering cloud over the gore. But it was the tracks that stopped me cold. They were everywhere in the soft earth, and they made no sense. Some were massive, five-toed footprints, deeply impressed, easily 18 inches long, like a man's, but far too large and with a strange, pronounced mid-tarsal break. Others were just as huge, but distinctly canine, four-toed with deep claw marks gouged into the dirt, a wolf track the size of a dinner plate. Two different predators, both of them impossibly large, had been here. My training kicked in, pushing back the cold knot of dread in my stomach. I took out my phone, documenting the scene. I knelt by one of the canine tracks, placing a standard-issue knife next to it for scale. The print dwarfed it. Then my eyes were drawn to the surrounding trees. Deep, parallel gouges were raked into the bark of a massive redwood, starting at about 7 feet off the ground. Claws. Thick, powerful claws had torn through the fibrous bark like it was wet cardboard. Caught in the splintered wood were tufts of fur. I pulled on a pair of latex gloves and carefully worked a few samples free. One was coarse and black, almost like a bear's, but longer and thicker. The other was wiry and gray, like from a timber wolf. But the individual strands were as thick as fishing line. I bagged the samples, labeling them meticulously. All the while, a feeling grew, crawling up my spine like a cold insect. The feeling of being watched. I scanned the dense tree line, my hand resting on the grip of my sidearm. Nothing moved. The forest remained unnervingly still. But I felt the weight of eyes on me, an intense, predatory focus that had nothing to do with the usual critters. This was different. This was intelligent. As I straightened up, ready to leave, a sound rolled through the trees from deep within the woods. It was a low, guttural growl, a vibration that I felt more in my bones than heard with my ears. It wasn't the sound of a bear or a mountain lion. It was deeper, more resonant, filled with a raw power that made the hair on my arms stand on end. Then, as quickly as it started, it was cut off. The oppressive silence crashed back in, heavier than before. I didn't run. Rangers don't run. But I backed away from the clearing slowly, deliberately, my gaze sweeping the shadows between the giant trees. I didn't turn my back until I was 100 yards away. Every step back to the truck felt like I was being judged. The forest wasn't just quiet. It was issuing a warning. A clear, silent, and terrifying message to stay away. I had stumbled into a territory marked by something ancient and savage, and for the first time in my career, I felt like an intruder in my own park. The ranger station felt like a sanctuary of fluorescent lights and humming electronics after the primal stillness of the deep woods. The smell of stale coffee was a welcome, mundane comfort. I found Laura Brandt in the small lab we shared, hunched over a microscope, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was the park's resident biologist, a sharp, no-nonsense woman I'd worked with for the better part of a decade. If anyone could make sense of what I'd found, it was her. "Hey, Laura," I said, setting the evidence bags on her clean metal countertop. "Got something for you. You might want to step away from the delicate ecosystem on that slide for a minute." She looked up, pushing her glasses up the bridge of her nose. "Wallace, don't tell me it's another case of deer mange. My week is already thrilling enough." Her eyes fell to the bags, and her professional curiosity immediately took over. She picked up the one with the black fur, holding it up to the light. "Wow, that's coarse," she murmured, rolling a strand between her gloved fingers. "Looks like black bear fur, but the follicle is all wrong. It's too dense. The shaft is almost twice the normal thickness. And it's long. Way too long for any bear in this region." She set it down and picked up the gray sample. Her eyebrows shot up. "Okay, this one's canine, no doubt. But look at the size of it. A wolf that left this would have to be the size of a pony. Where did you find these?" I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. At the center of a kill site that looked like a wood chipper had a grudge against the local deer population sentinel trail. I described the scene in detail, the scale of the slaughter, the unnatural quiet, the two distinct sets of colossal tracks. As I spoke, her expression shifted from academic interest to genuine concern. "Two different sets of tracks?" she asked, her voice low. "You're sure?" Positive one was a bipedal primate print, maybe 18 inches long. The other was a canid track, 15 inches across. Both were fresh. The claw marks on the trees were 7 feet up. Whatever did it was big and powerful. Laura was quiet for a moment, her gaze distant. She knew the forest as well as I did, but from a different perspective. She knew its rules, its biological impossibilities. The silence you mentioned, that's a predator avoidance response on a massive scale. The entire local fauna was hiding from something. She tapped a finger on the countertop. This is beyond weird, Jake. We need a proper analysis. I can run a basic DNA sequence here, but for something this anomalous, it needs to go to the university lab. They have the gear to break down anything. I nodded. Do it. The rest of the afternoon was a blur of paperwork and routine checks, but my mind kept drifting back to the clearing, to the feeling of being watched. By the time evening settled, casting long, deep shadows across the valley, an email pinged in Laura's inbox. I was in her office nursing a cup of coffee. When she opened it, I watched her face go pale under the glow of the monitor. She read the message aloud, her voice barely a whisper. It's from Sam, the head lab tech. It just says, "Code unidentifiable. Genetic markers are a mess. We need more samples. And call me." My stomach tightened. What does that mean? A mess? Laura swiveled in her chair to face me, her eyes wide. It means the sequencer couldn't match it to anything in the global database. Not bear, not wolf, not anything known. Sam attached the preliminary breakdown. Jake, this is impossible. She pointed a trembling finger at the screen. The black fur shows genetic markers consistent with primates, specifically the great apes, but it's hybridized with something else, something they can't identify. And the gray fur, it's predominantly canid, but it's cross-referenced with human and, get this, hyena DNA. The structure is a biological nightmare. I stared at her, the coffee cup forgotten in my hand. So what, we're looking at some kind of hybrid? Nature doesn't make hybrids like this, she said, her voice shaking slightly. A primate and a canine don't just mix. This isn't a liger or a mule. This is something that shouldn't exist. It breaks the laws of biology. I tried for a joke, a weak attempt to break the tension. So, what are we talking about? Bigfoot and the Wolfman decided to start a family? She didn't laugh. Her expression was dead serious. Don't joke, Jake. This material is real. The DNA is real. Whatever left this fur is out there. The cold dread from the forest returned, settling deep in my gut. A hoax was one thing. A genetically impossible predator was another. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was connected to that guttural growl, to the feeling of ancient, intelligent eyes watching me from the trees. Logic and training told me to wait for more data, to secure the area and post warnings. But instinct, the same instinct that had kept me alive in these woods for years, was screaming at me I had to know. I had to see it for myself, away from the sterile safety of the lab. I'm going back tonight, I said, the words coming out before I could think them through. Laura stood up, alarmed. Are you crazy? Jake, we don't know what we're dealing with. You saw what it did to those deer. That's why I have to go, I replied, my voice harder than I intended. If this is a prank, I need to find the evidence. If it's not, if it's real, then I need to know exactly what's hunting in my park. I grabbed my keys, the weight of the decision settling on me. I was trading the safety of fluorescent lights for the suffocating dark of the redwoods, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I was walking into a world that wasn't supposed to exist. The service road was a black tunnel boring through an even blacker world. My truck's headlights cut a weak, trembling swath through the fog that was rolling in from the coast, a thick, wet blanket common to Northern California nights. It swirled between the redwood trunks, muffling sound and turning the familiar forest into an alien landscape. Each giant tree that slid past my window seemed to lean in, a silent, dark sentinel watching me pass. I killed the headlights a quarter mile from the trailhead. navigating the last stretch by muscle memory. When I shut off the engine, the silence that fell was absolute. It was a physical presence, a weight on my eardrums. I sat for a long minute, letting my eyes adjust, my ears straining for any sound. Nothing. The forest was as unnaturally still as it had been that afternoon. Then I heard it. A distant percussive crack, not a gunshot. It was the sound of something massive snapping a tree limb, a branch as thick as my thigh. It was followed by another, and then another, moving slowly but deliberately through the woods to the north. I grabbed my pack and the thermal imager. The night air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of pine and decay. I moved off the road, my boots making soft sounds on the bed of redwood needles. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to get in my truck and drive until I saw streetlights. But the image of those tracks, of Laura's pale face in the glow of the monitor, pushed me forward. The thermal imager turned the world into a ghostly tableau of grays and whites. The massive redwood trunks were cold, black pillars. The ground held a faint residual warmth from the day I moved slowly, sweeping the imager back and forth. The path to the clearing was easy to follow, a slightly warmer trail against the cool forest floor. As I got closer, the coppery scent of blood, though faded, still hung in the air. I was about 50 yards from the clearing when the imager picked up a heat signature. It was large, a bright white blob moving behind the trees on the far side of the clearing. It was tall too, easily 8 or 9 feet. It moved with a slow, ponderous gait. My heart hammered against my ribs. I dropped into a crouch, my breathing shallow. Just as I was trying to process what I was seeing, another heat signature appeared. This one entering the clearing from the south. It was lower to the ground, faster, moving with a fluid, predatory lope. 2 of them. 2 massive, unidentified heat sources, converging on the same spot. I scrambled behind a fallen redwood, its immense trunk providing a solid wall of cover. Peering over the top, I switched to my night vision scope. The world snapped into a grainy, green-hued focus. And I saw them. The first creature stepped fully into the moonlight, filtering through the canopy. It was a nightmare made flesh. It stood on 2 legs, a mountain of muscle and shaggy black fur. Its arms were long and powerful, ending in thick human-like hands. Its head was conical, set low on a pair of impossibly broad shoulders. The proportions were all wrong, too wide, too bulky for anything natural. It moved with the rolling gait of a gorilla, its massive head turning slowly from side to side. It was a Bigfoot. The myth from grainy photos and campfire stories was standing less than 100 yards away from me, and it was terrifyingly real. Then the second creature emerged from the shadows. It was leaner, but no less menacing. It was canine, but it walked on its hind legs, its back hunched over in a permanent, painful-looking curve. Its legs were digitigrade, like a dog's, ending in huge, clawed paws. A long, wolf-like snout was filled with yellowed fangs, and its eyes glowed with a faint, predatory light in the night vision scope. Its fur was a matted, wiry gray, a dogman. Another legend, another impossibility, materialized from the darkness. They faced each other in the center of the clearing, the site of the earlier carnage. The air crackled with a tension so thick I could feel it. This wasn't a meeting. It was a confrontation. The Bigfoot let out a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the log I was hiding behind. The dogman answered with a series of guttural, clicking snarls. Then all hell broke loose. The Bigfoot charged, covering the distance between them in 3 massive strides. It swung a fist the size of a cinder block. a blow that should have pulped the dogman's skull. But the canine creature was impossibly fast. It ducked under the blow and lunged, its jaws snapping shut on the Bigfoot's shoulder. The ape-like creature roared, a sound of pure fury and pain that echoed through the silent forest, and grabbed the dogman by the scruff of its neck. With a grunt of immense effort, it tore the smaller creature free and hurled it a good 20 feet, sending it crashing into a thicket of ferns. The dogman was back on its feet in an instant, seemingly unfazed. It circled, low to the ground, its movements fluid and terrifyingly intelligent. The Bigfoot stood its ground, pounding its chest with its fists, the impacts like a deep drumbeat. They charged each other again, a whirlwind of black and gray fur, claws, and teeth. The sound was sickening. The wet tear of flesh, the crack of bone, the dull thud of heavy bodies colliding. They weren't just animals fighting. This was a war, a vicious personal battle between two titans. I lay frozen behind the log, my mind struggling to accept what my eyes were seeing. The campfire stories, the blurry videos, the hushed whispers, they were all true. These things were real. And they were fighting a brutal ancient war in the shadows of the redwoods, a war that until this moment humanity had been completely oblivious to. I was a witness to something primal, something that defied every law of nature I had ever known. And I had the sinking feeling that being a witness was the most dangerous thing I could possibly be. The brutal ballet of violence came to an abrupt, shocking halt. The dogman, with a surge of wiry strength, twisted out of the Bigfoot's grasp, raked its claws across the larger creature's chest, and shoved it back. The Bigfoot stumbled, roaring in frustration, and crashed against the trunk of a redwood with a ground-shaking thud. For a moment, there was a lull, and in that silence, the dogman's head snapped up. Its snout twitched, its ears swiveling. It lifted its head and tasted the air. It had caught my scent. Its glowing eyes scanned the darkness and locked directly onto my hiding spot. There was no mistaking it. The creature knew I was there. A low, menacing growl rumbled in its chest, a completely different sound from the one it had used against its rival. This was the sound of a predator that has found new, more interesting prey. The Bigfoot, recovering from the blow, saw the dogman shift in focus. It followed the smaller creature's gaze, and its own dark, deep-set eyes found me. A low, guttural roar erupted from its massive chest, not of fury, but of territorial challenge. It was impossible to read the intent, but the message was clear. My presence was not welcome. The fragile, violent truce between them was shattered, replaced by a shared, sudden interest in me. My training overrode my paralysis. Retreat. Do not engage. I pushed myself backward, trying to crawl away from the log without making a sound. It was a fool's errand. A dry twig snapped under my hand with the crack of a rifle shot. That was all it took. The dogman exploded into motion. It didn't run. It bounded, covering the 50 yards between us in a series of terrifying, ground-eating leaps. The sheer speed was breathtaking. I had seconds, maybe less. I scrambled to my feet, yanking the high-intensity flashlight from my belt. I thumbed the switch, unleashing a blinding 3,000 lumen beam of pure white light directly into the creature's face. It shrieked, a high-pitched sound of pain and rage, and recoiled, throwing a clawed paw over its sensitive eyes. It gave me the opening I needed. I turned and ran, not looking back, plunging into the pitch-black forest away from the clearing. Adrenaline surged through me. A hot, metallic fire in my veins, I risked a glance over my shoulder. The Bigfoot had used the momentary distraction to charge. It slammed its shoulder into the blinded dogman, sending the creature tumbling. But it wasn't an attack meant to kill. It was a shove, a way to clear the path. Both monsters had forgotten their ancient feud. They had a new game now, and I was it. The chase was a nightmare of chaotic, desperate flight. I crashed through ferns and dodged low-hanging branches, the air burning in my lungs behind me. I could hear them. The Bigfoot was a force of nature, a living bulldozer, snapping saplings and crashing through the undergrowth with thunderous footfalls that made the ground tremble. The Dogman was more sinister. It was faster, its movements punctuated by the soft padding of its paws and the occasional sharp crack of a branch under its weight. They weren't working together, but their combined presence boxed me in, their massive shadows flickering at the edges of my vision as they flanked me, hurting me. Panic clawed at me, threatening to swallow my reason. I had to think. Where could I go? The truck was too far, and they would catch me in the open. I needed high ground. I needed a defensible position. Then, through the trees, I saw a familiar silhouette against the fog-shrouded sky, the old fire tower on Buckman's Ridge. It was decommissioned years ago, a skeletal relic from another era, but it was steel and wood enclosed 100 feet off the ground. If I could make it there, I might stand a chance. I veered left, pushing my legs harder, my body screaming in protest. The sounds behind me grew closer, more frantic. They knew I was heading for a destination. The hunt was reaching its climax. The roar of the Bigfoot echoed to my right, answered by a snarling howl from the Dogman on my left. They were closing in. The base of the tower loomed out of the darkness. The old wooden stairs groaned in protest as I threw my weight onto them. Taking them 2, 3 at a time, I could hear the creatures crashing through the trees at the base of the ridge. I fumbled with the rusted latch on the trapdoor to the cabin, my fingers slick with sweat. It gave way with a screech of tortured metal. I hauled myself inside, slamming the heavy wooden door shut and throwing the thick iron bolt just as a tremendous impact shuddered through the entire structure. One of them had thrown itself against the tower's legs. I crawled to one of the grimy windows and looked down. 2 pairs of glowing eyes stared back up at me from the darkness they weren't leaving. They began to circle the base of the tower, a patient, predatory patrol. I was trapped, a rat in a cage, suspended 100 feet in the air, with 2 living myths waiting for me below. The cabin of the fire tower was a time capsule of neglect. Dust motes danced in the beam of my flashlight, illuminating a room filled with ghosts. An old metal desk, a rusted wood-burning stove, and on the wall, a series of faded, curling maps of the reserve. Pinned to a corkboard were what caught my eye. Old, hand-drawn schematics, yellowed with age. I ran my light over them. They were diagrams for emergency fire breaks and containment measures designed by rangers in the 1970s. But mixed in with them were cruder drawings, designs for large game traps, snares made from steel cable, deadfall traps using counterweights, and trigger-rigged noisemakers. These weren't for deer or bears. These were for something bigger. A cold realization washed over me. I wasn't the first ranger to encounter something impossibly large in these woods. Down below, a heavy, rhythmic thudding began. Thump, thump, thump. The Bigfoot was methodically slamming its shoulder into one of the steel support legs. The whole tower vibrated with each impact. It wasn't trying to knock it down, not yet. It was testing it, probing for weakness. The Dogman, meanwhile, was silent. I could no longer see its glowing eyes that was somehow more terrifying. The brute was trying to force me out while the hunter was waiting patiently for me to make a mistake. They weren't going anywhere. This was their territory, and they were playing with their food. My fear began to recede, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged determination. I was a ranger. This was my park. I wasn't going to die cowering in a dusty box 100 feet in the air. Those old schematics gave me an idea, a desperate, half-insane plan. I scanned the cabin. Under a pile of old canvases, I found a coil of weathered steel cable, and a heavy-duty carabiner tucked in a corner was a small, hand-cranked winch. Not much, but it was a start. My eyes then fell to a small, square outline on the floor. I'd almost missed a maintenance hatch. I pried it open. It led to a small service ladder bolted to the underside of the cabin. Descending into the darkness of the framework, it was a way out, a path they wouldn't be expecting. I slung the cable over my shoulder, clipped the gear to my belt, and slipped through the hatch, closing it silently above me. I descended the ladder, the cold steel rungs biting into my hands. The thudding of the Bigfoot was louder here. The vibrations traveling directly through the tower's metal skeleton. I moved like a ghost, climbing down the interior of the support structure, using the crisscrossing beams as handholds. Until I was about 20 feet from the ground, I could see the Bigfoot below, its massive back to me, as it continued its assault on the opposite leg. The dogman was nowhere in sight. I dropped the last 10 feet, landing softly on a thick patch of moss, and melted into the shadows. My target was an area about 300 yards down the northern slope, a controlled burn zone from a decade ago. I knew it well. The fire had cleared out the undergrowth, but the Park Service had left behind some of the equipment, specifically a series of deep-set steel anchor posts used for securing water lines. They were perfect anchors. Moving through the woods was a masterclass in stealth I didn't know I possessed. Every snapped twig, every rustled leaf, sounded like a gunshot to my own ears. I could hear the Bigfoot abandon its assault on the tower with a frustrated grunt, followed by a series of heavy footfalls as it began to search. Then a new sound reached me, a low, sniffing sound, moving methodically through the brush. The dogman was actively tracking me by scent. I reached the burn zone, a clearing of sparse new growth dotted with charred stumps, and the steel posts. I remembered I worked fast, adrenaline and desperation lending speed to my fingers. I used the winch to create tension on the steel cable, running it from a heavy anchor post to the base of a dead, precariously balanced pine tree. A good hard yank on the tripwire, a thin cord I strung across a narrow game trail, and the whole thing would come crashing down. Next, I fashioned a crude snare, a loop of cable cinched to the base of a thick oak and hidden under a layer of leaves and duff. It wasn't a killing trap, but it might be enough to disable one of them, to buy me time. Finally, I emptied a few spare fuel canisters for the station's generator into a small depression, creating a makeshift noise and scent lure. A loud roar echoed from the west. The Bigfoot. It was getting impatient, resorting to brute force and intimidation. A moment later, a series of sharp, wheezing barks answered from the east the dogman. They had separated. My blood ran cold as the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. They weren't just hunting me. They were competing. It was a territorial dispute played out with me as the prize. And I was standing right in the middle of their deadly game board. The forest fell silent again, but this time it was the charged silence before a storm. I was crouched behind a cluster of charred logs, my hand gripping the thin tripwire for the deadfall trap the bait was set. Now all I could do was wait and listen. The first sign of its approach wasn't a sound, but a vibration. A deep, rhythmic tremor in the earth, the footfalls of something immensely heavy. Then came the noise, the indifferent, arrogant cracking of branches and saplings being pushed aside. It wasn't trying to be stealthy. It was announcing its presence. A king striding through his domain. A massive, dark shape blotted out the stars between the trees. The Bigfoot. It was coming from the west, just as I'd predicted, drawn by the most direct path to where it had last sensed me. It lumbered into the burn zone, its huge head swiveling, its dark eyes scanning the clearing. It stood for a moment, a 9-foot-tall silhouette of primal power, and sniffed the air. My heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of my chest. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. My little snare was laid out directly in its path. Come on, you big, dumb ape. Just a few more steps. It took a step, then another. Its left foot, a monstrous slab of flesh and bone, came down squarely in the center of the leafy patch hiding my trap. The loop of steel cable snapped tight around its ankle. The result was instantaneous and cataclysmic. The Bigfoot let out a bellow of surprised rage. It didn't just fall. It crashed, trying to pull its leg free. The steel cable, anchored to the deep-set post, held firm. The creature's momentum carried it forward, and it went down like one of its native redwoods, shaking the very ground as it hit. It landed hard, tearing up roots and soil with its massive hands as it roared in fury. It thrashed on the ground, a whirlwind of black fur and raw muscle. The steel cable creaked and groaned, the anchor post visibly straining in the earth, but it held. The creature's eyes, when they found me crouched behind the logs, were no longer just predatory. They were filled with a furious, intelligent rage, and something else I hadn't expected: pain. The cable had cut deep into its ankle. This was my chance. I couldn't kill it, but I could disorient it. I pulled the flare gun from my pack, a piece of standard equipment I'd never expected to use as a weapon. I aimed it high, over the creature's head, and fired. The red flare shot into the sky with a loud hiss, exploding 100 feet up in a burst of brilliant chemical crimson. The clearing was bathed in an unnatural, hellish red light. The Bigfoot, its eyes accustomed to the deep dark of the forest, roared in agony and shielded its face with its massive arms. The sudden, overwhelming light was too much for it. It was blinded, disoriented, its roars now a mixture of pain and confusion. I didn't wait to see more. I scrambled back, deeper into the shadows of the woods, my feet flying over the uneven ground. The flare burned out, plunging the clearing back into darkness. Behind me, I heard a sound like a car being torn in half, a screech of protesting metal, and the groan of stressed earth. Then a final, deafening snap. The Bigfoot had ripped the entire steel anchor post out of the ground, concrete footing and all. The thrashing stopped. I could hear its heavy, labored breathing. The steel post, still tethered to its ankle by the cable, scraped and dragged against the ground as the creature slowly, painfully, got to its feet. It was wounded. The snare hadn't held it, but it had done its job. It had hurt the beast, and more importantly, it had bought me precious time. I ducked behind a thicket, heart pounding, and listened. The heavy, dragging sound moved away from me, heading deeper into the forest to the north. The Bigfoot was retreating, limping away to lick its wounds. The intense, oppressive feeling of its presence faded, leaving behind only the echo of its earth-shaking footsteps. I had won the first round. But as the adrenaline began to ebb, a chilling thought crept in. I had dealt with the brute force. Now, I had to contend with the cunning hunter. And somewhere in the silent woods around me, the dog man was still stalking. With the Bigfoot gone, The forest changed. The loud crashing sounds were replaced by an unnerving predatory silence. This was a different kind of hunt. I could feel it. This one would be a game of wits, not just survival. I moved carefully, my senses on high alert. Making my way toward the ridge where I'd rigged my second set of traps, the air was still, and every sound seemed amplified. I could hear the frantic beat of my own heart, the soft scuff of my boots on the forest floor. I was halfway to the ridge when I heard a soft click, followed by the metallic rattle of a chain. I froze, dropping into a crouch. It came from my left. Near the deadfall trap I'd set, I had used a line of small, empty cans as a noisemaker, a primitive alarm system. Something had just triggered it. But there was no crash, no sound of a falling tree creeping forward. I peered through a thick fern. I saw the tripwire sagging and limp, and next to it in the soft dirt was a single, massive canine track the creature hadn't blundered through. It had stopped, assessed the trap, and deliberately nudged the tripwire with its snout or a paw before calmly stepping over it. A cold wave of fear, colder than any I'd felt yet, washed over me. This thing wasn't just an animal. It was smart. Deceptively, terrifyingly smart. It had seen my crude attempt at engineering and had disarmed it without breaking stride. My plan had to change. Brute force traps wouldn't work on this one. I needed misdirection. I needed to play on its primary weapon, its sense of smell. I backtracked, circling around the disarmed trap, and dug into my pack. I found what I was looking for. A small canister of concentrated bear repellent, a pungent, eye-watering mix of capsaicin and other foul chemicals, and a small flask of kerosene for the old lanterns at the station. This was a long shot, a desperate gambit. I found a game trail that led away from my intended path and doused a line of bushes with the mixture. The acrid smell of the repellent combined with the petroleum scent of the kerosene created a bizarre, potent odor. To a human, it was just foul. But to an animal with a sense of smell 1,000 times more sensitive, it would be an overwhelming, confusing blast of chemical information. Masking my own scent trail completely, I hoped it would act as a false trail, drawing the creature away. With the scent trap laid, I made for the trees. I pulled the climbing rope and harness from my pack. More standard gear I was now thanking my past self for maintaining. I found a tall, thick-limbed Douglas fir, one that offered a clear view of the surrounding area. I strapped myself in and began to ascend, moving quickly and quietly 30 feet up. I found a sturdy branch, secured my line, and settled in, making myself as small as possible. Now, it was a waiting game. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The forest was silent. I started to wonder if my trick had worked, if the dogman was miles away, chasing a chemical ghost. Then I saw it. A flicker of gray movement at the edge of the clearing below. It emerged from the shadows, not with a lope, but with a slow, deliberate, stalking gait. It moved with a terrifying grace. Its hunched form hugging the ground, it was testing the air, its long snout twitching. It reached the spot where I had laid the false scent trail. It stopped dead. Its head tilted, a curiously intelligent gesture. It sniffed the repellent-soaked leaves, then let out a low, soft growl of what sounded like annoyance. It didn't follow the trail. It knew it was a trick. It simply turned its head, its glowing eyes scanning the area, knowing I had to be close. It lifted its head higher, its snout pointed directly toward my tree. It couldn't see me, but it was catching my scent on the rising air currents. Its nostrils flared. It had me. It took a slow step toward the base of the fir, its gaze fixed on the branches above. its yellow eyes seeming to stare right into mine. A low guttural purr, like a monstrous cat, rumbled in its chest. The game was over. Panic seized me. I was trapped, exposed. In a last, desperate act of misdirection, I grabbed a loose piece of bark from the trunk next to me and flung it as hard as I could into a thicket of bushes about 50 feet to my left. The sound of the bark hitting the leaves was barely audible, but for the creature's hypersensitive ears, it was enough. Its head snapped toward the noise, its attention momentarily diverted. It took a single bounding step in that direction, convinced its prey had just revealed its position. It was the opening I needed, and it came at the perfect time. From deep in the woods to the north, a deafening roar of pure agony and rage tore through the night. The Bigfoot. It had recovered, and it was coming back. The forest floor began to vibrate once more. The dogman froze, its hunt for me instantly forgotten. It turned to face the oncoming sound, its lips curling back to reveal a full set of dagger-like teeth. The hunt was over, but the war was about to begin again. The Bigfoot's roar wasn't just a sound. It was a physical force. It ripped through the trees, shaking leaves from their branches and silencing every lesser creature for miles. The dogman, which had been seconds from finding me, was now completely focused on the returning threat. It lowered itself into a defensive crouch, its hackles raised, a low, continuous snarl vibrating in its chest. The air grew heavy, thick with the promise of imminent violence. I used their renewed focus on each other to my advantage. I descended the tree with a speed born of pure terror, my hands burning on the rope. The moment my boots touched the ground, I was running not away, but towards a specific location my frantic mind had dredged up from my memory of the park's terrain maps. The Dry Creek Ravine. It was a deep, scar-like gash in the earth, 100 yards long and maybe 20 feet deep. Left over from a wildfire and subsequent flash flood years ago, its steep, gravelly sides were notoriously unstable. It was my only chance at creating a real barrier. Behind me, the two monsters met with a titanic crash. The sounds were even more horrific up close. The wet, sickening crunch of blows landing, the guttural shrieks of pain and fury. I didn't dare look back, I just ran, my lungs on fire, the sounds of their epic battle providing a terrifying soundtrack to my flight. I scrambled into the ravine, the loose rock and soil skidding under my boots. The place reeked of charcoal and old ash, even after all these years. Piles of dry pine needles and dead branches, perfect tinder, had collected at the bottom. My desperate plan began to take shape. I worked with frantic energy, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. I dragged the driest branches and debris into a rough, wide circle in the center of the ravine floor. It was a giant makeshift funeral pyre. I could hear the fight moving closer. They were tumbling and brawling their way across the forest floor, their battle spilling in my direction. I fumbled in my pack for my emergency kit and pulled out a small Zippo lighter and a canister of accelerant. I doused the ring of branches. A huge dark shape appeared at the lip of the ravine. The Bigfoot. It had the dogman pinned under one massive foot, but the smaller creature was tearing at its leg with teeth and claws. The Bigfoot saw me. It let out a roar of triumph and anger, and with a final brutal stomp, it kicked the dogman away. It started to lumber down the steep incline, sending a shower of rocks and dirt ahead of it. I sparked the lighter. The flame caught with a whoosh, and a wall of fire 10 feet high erupted in a perfect circle around me. The sudden heat was intense, the light blinding. The Bigfoot stopped short, roaring at the unexpected barrier. The fire fascinated and enraged it. It slapped at the flames with its huge hands, pulling back with a shriek of pain as the fire licked its fur. It was cautious, hesitant to cross the fiery ring. But the dogman was not. It had recovered and was now standing on the opposite edge of the ravine. It saw the Bigfoot's hesitation. It saw me, trapped within the circle of my own making. And it jumped. It launched itself through the air in a terrifying arc. A gray streak of fur and teeth clearing a good 20 feet. Its target was the center of my fiery sanctuary. It was exactly what I had hoped for. In the center of the ring, I had concealed a section of old, rotten cargo netting I'd found snagged on a log. Covering it with a thin layer of dust and leaves, it was a pitifully weak trap, but it was set over a section of ground that had been badly undercut by the long-gone flash flood. The dogman landed squarely on the netting. For a split second, it seemed to hold. Then, with a loud crack, the ground beneath the netting gave way. The creature yelped in surprise as it plunged into the hidden pit, a drop of about 10 feet. The cargo netting tangled around its limbs, hampering its movements as it tried to claw its way up the crumbling sides of the hole. The forest roared. The Bigfoot, seeing its rival trapped and helpless, forgot all about me. Its territorial imperative, its ancient hatred, took over completely. It let out a triumphant bellow and charged, crashing through the wall of fire with a final, agonized roar as the flames seared its flesh. It ignored the pain, its eyes fixed on the struggling dogman in the pit. It was going in for the kill. The two titans were together again, their ancient battle resuming in the fiery pit I had created, and I was still trapped between them. The scene in the ravine was a tableau from hell. The Bigfoot, its fur smoldering, was tearing at the edges of the pit, trying to get at the snarling, tangled dogman below. The roar of the flames mixed with the guttural shrieks of the two monsters. This was my only chance to escape. While they were utterly consumed by their hatred for each other, I scrambled up the far side of the ravine, the loose scree giving way with every step. Behind me, a furious roar signaled a change. The Bigfoot had managed to hook its massive hands under the netting and, with a heave of unimaginable strength, had ripped the entire thing, dogman and all, out of the pit. It flung the smaller creature against the ravine wall with a sickening crunch. The game wasn't over. They were both free. I ran. My destination was the last geographical feature I could think of that might offer an escape. The Swiftwater River, a fast-moving artery of snowmelt and mountain springs that cut a deep gorge through the park's northern edge. It was dangerous, but it was my only hope. I pulled my last flare gun from my pack, not for them, for me. I fired it straight up into the night sky. The brilliant red light was a beacon, a desperate signal for any search party that might be looking for me. A long shot, but the only one I had. The sounds of pursuit were immediate. The heavy, ground-shaking footfalls of the Bigfoot and the faster, rhythmic padding of the dogman. They had put their fight on hold again. The thrill of the hunt for a common enemy was too strong. I reached the riverbank, my breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The roar of the water was deafening. The soil here was soft and loamy, perpetually damp. Massive redwoods grew right up to the edge, their roots exposed and undercut by the relentless current. I had scouted this area a few months back after a storm, noting the instability. One of the giants, an ancient behemoth, was barely clinging to the bank, its root system almost entirely washed away. In my pack, among my emergency tools, was a lightweight, battery-powered saw. It was designed for clearing small, fallen branches from trails, not for felling 1,000-ton trees, but it was all I had. I had pre-cut a deep wedge into the river-facing side of the trunk on a previous patrol, marking it as a hazard to be dealt with later was now. I yanked the saw out, my hands trembling with exhaustion, and jammed it into the existing cut. The saw screamed in protest, biting into the dense, ancient wood. I could hear them crashing through the trees behind me, getting closer with every second. The high-pitched whine of the saw was a beacon, drawing them straight to me. The tree groaned, a deep, resonant sound like a dying giant. Fibers began to pop and snap. The ground beneath my feet trembled. They burst from the tree line simultaneously. The Bigfoot, its fur singed and matted, its eyes burning with raw fury. The dogman limping heavily but no less menacing, its lips peeled back in a permanent bloody snarl. They saw me, saw the teetering tree, and charged. I gave the trunk one last desperate shove with my shoulder. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, with a final, agonizing groan, the great redwood began to fall. It didn't just timber over. It tore a massive section of the riverbank away with it. The ground I was standing on dropped out from under me. I threw myself backward as the tree, the bank, and a literal ton of earth and rock collapsed into the raging river. The two monsters, caught in their forward charge, had no time to react. They were carried over the edge with the landslide, their roars of fury turning into surprised shrieks as they were plunged into the icy, turbulent water. The current seized them immediately. They were immensely powerful, but they were no match for the force of the Swiftwater River I watched clinging to a stable root as they were swept away. Tumbling end over end, two mythical beasts rendered helpless by the raw power of nature, they were carried downstream, towards the narrow, violent rapids of the gorge, a place from which nothing ever returned. The sounds of their struggle were quickly swallowed by the roar of the river, and then they were gone. I don't remember much about the next hour. I think I just lay there on the muddy, torn-up riverbank, shaking uncontrollably, listening to the roar of the water. The next thing I knew, flashlight beams were cutting through the pre-dawn gloom, and I heard Laura's voice calling my name. They found me covered in mud and grime, my clothes shredded, my body a mass of cuts and bruises. Laura and a couple of sheriff's deputies helped me to my feet. I looked like a man who had survived a war, which in a way I had.
"Jake, my God, what happened to you?"
Laura's face was a mixture of relief and horror. I tried to tell them. I tried to explain the clearing, the chase, the fire tower, the two impossible creatures. The words tumbled out. A frantic, disjointed narrative of myth and violence. The deputies exchanged glances, the kind of look reserved for drunks or madmen. The official report would be simple. Ranger Wallace got lost, suffered a panic attack, maybe had a run-in with a large, aggressive bear. Stress can do strange things to a man alone in the woods at night. They nodded politely, but they didn't believe a word. My superiors, when they arrived, were even more dismissive, talking about mandatory leave and psychological evaluations. As the sun began to rise, casting a pale gray light over the scene, I walked back to the edge of the shattered riverbank. The deputies were taking pictures documenting the landslide, and then I saw it. On a flat, muddy stone that hadn't been washed away, there was a single perfect print. A bare foot, five-toed, with a distinct mid-tarsal break. It was almost 20 inches long. Too big to be human, too clear to be a trick of the light. I pointed. "There, look." Laura came over, her eyes following my finger. She knelt, her scientific curiosity overriding everything else. She stared at the print, her face losing all its color. She looked from the track to me, and in her eyes, I saw the dawning horror of belief. "It's real," she whispered, so softly only I could hear. "It's all real." I knew the creatures weren't dead. The river was powerful, but they were something else entirely. They were primal forces. The gorge would not have been the end for them, merely an inconvenience. They were pushed out, washed down river, but they would survive. They had merely retreated, deeper into the vast, unexplored wilderness of the Humboldt forests, back to the shadows where they belonged. I kept my job, the official story stood, and I let it. What else could I do? Who would believe the truth? I became the ranger who cracked, the guy who saw bears behind every tree, but my patrols changed. I carried heavier gear now. I paid more attention to the silence. I knew what the forest was hiding, and I knew my job wasn't just to protect the park from people, but to protect people from the park sometimes, on a clear cold night when the wind is just right. I can hear something carried on the breeze from deep within the mountains. It's a distant, echoing roar, a sound that shakes the soul. And sometimes, if I listen very closely, I can hear a second, snarling howl answering it. It's not a sound of conflict anymore. It's a call and response. The hunt is over. The feud is back on. And I am the only one who knows the two monsters have found each other once again.